Yes, my friends, things are starting to heat up behind the scenes for the Miami Dolphins, and we need to talk about something that could become very important for this offense. We all know how much a quarterback depends on having receivers he can trust, and if Miami really wants to find out whether Malik Willis can be the quarterback of the future, they cannot afford to get this part wrong. The Dolphins have already shown signs that they may not be completely done with this wide receiver room, and now some very interesting possibilities are starting to appear. So I want to know which side you're on. Do you believe Miami already has enough talent at wide receiver, or should the Dolphins make another move to give Malik Willis more help? Write your opinion in the comments. And if you've been a Miami Dolphins fan for more than 15 years, hit that like button hard. Alright, my friends, because the Dolphins reportedly showed interest in Stefon Diggs before he signed with Washington, and that tells us something important. Let's talk about what Miami could be planning next. The biggest reason this conversation is happening is Stefon Diggs. According to Adam Schefter, before Diggs ended up signing with Washington, the Dolphins were one of the teams that reached out to the veteran wide receiver. Miami ultimately did not sign him, but the important part for Dolphins fans is that the interest existed, because think about what that tells us. Miami apparently looked at this current group of receivers and still decided it was worth making contact with an established veteran. That does not guarantee another move is coming, but it certainly suggests that John Eric Sullivan and the Dolphins are willing to explore opportunities if the right receiver becomes available. And when you look at the situation around Malik Willis, it makes sense. Chris Bell is still working his way back from knee surgery after the injury he suffered last November, and there is no clear answer yet about exactly when the rookie will be ready to get onto the field. Miami did add several receivers during the offseason. The Dolphins drafted Bell, Caleb Douglas, and Kevin Coleman, and they also brought in veterans Jalen Tolbert and Tutu Atwell. There are options in the room. What Miami still needs to find out is whether one of those options can become the reliable target Willis can consistently trust. There have been flashes from Caleb Douglas and Malik Washington, but based on what has been seen so far, there has not been one receiver who has clearly separated himself as the obvious go-to target for Willis. That matters because evaluating Willis might be one of the most important jobs Miami has this season. The Dolphins need to learn whether he can truly become a starting quarterback in the NFL and potentially be their answer for the future. But there is a difficult question that comes with that evaluation. How confidently can you judge your quarterback if you are not completely confident in the receivers around him? That is why another addition could make sense. And this is not the first time Miami has explored the possibility. After the draft, Jawan Jennings was viewed as an attractive option, and the Dolphins were reportedly in contact with him as well, but nothing happened. Now we know Miami also contacted Stefon Diggs before he signed elsewhere. So there is a pattern worth watching. The Dolphins have at least explored adding another receiver. The problem is that the free agent market does not offer many exciting solutions anymore. Diggs is gone. Tyreek Hill remains available, but a return to Miami is not viewed as a realistic solution, and there is also uncertainty about when he will be able to return to the football field. The expectation discussed in the source is that Chris Bell could potentially get onto the field before Hill does. That brings us to Keenan Allen. Allen is 34 years old and is probably the most recognizable option remaining among the available receivers being discussed. He is primarily a slot receiver, and he still produced 707 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns last season. Those numbers show that he can still contribute. But there are two obvious questions. Would Miami want to add a 34-year-old receiver at this stage of what the team is building? And would Allen want to join Miami when, if he continues playing, he could prefer an opportunity with a team that is closer to competing immediately? There's another reason not to expect this move. Barry Jackson reported that, as of last month, the Dolphins had not called or contacted Allen. So while his name naturally comes up because of what remains on the free agent market, there is nothing from the information we have that indicates Miami is actively pursuing him. And honestly, once you get beyond Allen, the available free agent choices become difficult to justify. Miami already has Atwell, Tolbert, and several young receivers it wants to evaluate. Bringing in another player just for the sake of making a move does not necessarily improve this football team. That means the more interesting possibilities could come from somewhere else. There are really two paths Miami can watch if it still wants another meaningful receiver: make a trade, or wait for roster cuts around the league and see who suddenly becomes available. That second option should not be ignored. Every year, teams are forced to make difficult decisions when they get down to their final rosters. A player who looks buried on one team's depth chart can suddenly become useful somewhere else. Miami has benefited from that kind of opportunity before. A year ago, under the previous regime with Chris Greer, the Dolphins found players after roster cutdown who now project to have significant roles. Juju Brents was claimed after roster cuts and now projects as Miami's CB2. Greg Dulcich was signed to the practice squad after being released by the Giants, eventually reached the active roster and now looks like Miami's top tight end. Think about that. Two players currently projected for important roles were found after other teams made their roster decisions. There is no guarantee the same thing happens at wide receiver, but it shows why Miami should remain patient and watch what happens around the league. A talented receiver could lose a numbers game somewhere else and suddenly become available. But if the Dolphins do not want to wait, the trade market gives them some very interesting names to monitor. Jerry Jeudy is one of them. Jeudy came into the NFL as a highly regarded prospect from Alabama, and his last 2 seasons in Cleveland have been very different. He had a 1,200-yard season before seeing his production drop significantly last year in receptions, yards, and touchdowns. Drops have been an issue throughout his career, but Jeudy remains a strong route runner. Would he be a true number 1 receiver on a top NFL offense? That can certainly be questioned. But on this current Miami roster, he could immediately have an opportunity to become the leading receiver. And the possible price makes the idea more interesting. The trade value discussed for Jeudy is around a conditional 4th-round pick. He is under contract for 2026 and 2027, and his base salary is under $2 million, although there are incentives and roster bonuses involved. The expectation presented is that Miami would not have to pay more than roughly $10 million if it acquired him. So if Cleveland really would listen to an offer around a conditional 4th-round selection, Miami at least has a reason to make the phone call. But Jeudy is not the only name. New England could become one of the most interesting teams to watch because of how crowded its wide receiver room is. 2 players in particular stand out, Keyshawn Boutte and Kyle Williams. The situation is simple. New England has a lot of receivers, and keeping everybody might not be realistic. That could leave one of Boutte or Williams vulnerable as the roster takes shape. Boutte is a name Dolphins fans have heard plenty about in these discussions. He was New England's starting X-receiver last season, but his role has changed because the Patriots now have A.J. Brown. What Boutte does well overlaps with what Brown brings to the offense, and when a team adds a receiver of Brown's level, somebody else's opportunities are naturally going to shrink. That does not necessarily mean Boutte suddenly became a bad football player. In Miami, his opportunity could look completely different. The belief expressed in the source is that Boutte could potentially produce 700 or 800 receiving yards with the Dolphins, with even the possibility of approaching 1,000 yards if everything went right. He is not being described as a true number 1 receiver, but he could fit as a lower-level WR2 or a strong WR3. For this Dolphins roster, that could still be extremely useful. There is also an interesting Miami connection in the sense that Boutte spends much of his offseason living and training in Miami. The potential cost discussed